Hello there, my name's Card. I'm a long-time progressive community organiser, and today I'd like to make something of a brief little PSA about something people might need to be reminded of every once in a while. That is, leftists, on the whole, need to be able to identify reactionary dog whistles and in-jokes in order to be able to call them out more effectively. At the moment, I'm sure most of my fellow progressives would agree with that statement, but I see very few people around, offline or online, seemingly who can in practice. Just in case you're inexplicably listening to me right now without knowing what I mean by that, the briefest possible explanation is essentially that a dog whistle, in the sense we'll be using, is something like a word or a phrase or a picture that looks and sounds completely innocent and innocuous, but actually communicates a second, much more sinister meaning to a small in-group of people you can't address openly. It's a message that only a select group can understand the real meaning behind, and the term itself comes from how, if you blow a literal actual dog whistle, obviously dogs can hear the high-pitched tone, but people can't. And anyone who takes their progressivism seriously really ought to be doing more not to let people on the far right get away with using them. If you're familiar with the term already, then spotting dog whistles might sound like something that only really matters if you're too online. But what really spurred me on to think about how necessary this is was that I was at a left-wing counter-protest of some assorted reactionaries a little while back now, alongside plenty of people I've done heaps of other community defense type stuff with, and on this occasion, in between the usual slogan-bearing placards and signs being carried by the right-wingers there, I noticed quite a few that were outright invoking a lot of coded racial slurs and neo-Nazi in-jokes. I pointed these out to the people I was with at the time, and I was surprised to realise just how little known this stuff was, even among some otherwise very knowledgeable and grounded lefties. It really left me with the impression that the broad progressive left community might not be able to spot this sort of thing as well as I had assumed based off of how I could. Perhaps that's just a consequence of the fact that I'm not averse to lurking some of the more reprobate websites around to see what reactionaries are up to. But I'm going to take the position that us on the left could benefit from that level of familiarity with the right's tropes. After all, knowing is half the battle. Now, when I bring up this sort of thing in conversation with other progressives and explain the concept, they do tend to be able to recognize this sort of behavior in some of the more prominent examples right away. For example, when a conservative commentator, like Tucker Carlson, says heritage Americans are under attack, when he's trying to whip up anxious anger among his base. It means white people. It's all but just doing a neo-Nazi talking point, except if you don't throw just the slightest veneer over the top of it, it would be significantly harder to defend saying. Or you might hear someone denounce the elites for trying to undermine polite society for their own ends. They're just doing general anti-Semitic tropes without ever coming right out with it and saying it's the Jews. Traditional values, or family values, or hilariously, Judeo-Christian values, is almost always a stand-in for something homophobic or transphobic. There's countless others floating around out there among even mainstream conservative media outlets and press pools. Welfare queens, states' rights, that sort of thing. Political science students will be all too familiar with the oft-cited quote by American GOP consultant Lee Atwater regarding the so-called Southern strategy, and how, by the 1960s, you couldn't win public support by just openly screaming racial epithets any longer. But I think that if you assume that dog whistles and coded messaging is something only being perpetuated by professional politicians and media figures, you've vastly missed the mark here. People like Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, and Paul Joseph Watson all now have, or have had, substantially large followings picked up through spewing all the same barely disguised right-wing talking points conservative old media does, just now in a slick online format. You're correct to point these sorts of people out and to denounce them, but what I want to focus on calling out here is the sort of dog whistling being done by no-name reactionary individuals. People with no public presence of any kind, but who hold super exceedingly far-right views and to attempt to covertly signal their fascistic sympathies to other reactionaries. What this looks like in practice is a long list of esoteric symbols, memes, abbreviations, and in-jokes that might outwardly appear nonsensical or even completely random, getting surreptitiously spread around anonymously by lone reactionary cretins looking for others of their own kind. Look closely, and you just might see them being commented all over the internet, even or especially all over regular mainstream sites like YouTube and Facebook. They're also being made into stickers and put where you might least expect them, in public spaces. In recent years, the iconography used by these people to communicate has looked like oblique references to everything from clowns, to milk, to frogs, to the OK hand sign, and dozens of practically arbitrary emojis. It's all built up over years and years into this multi-layered pseudo-lore where just about anything can become a signifier of the far right. The ones I just mentioned are some of the more widely known nowadays, but definitionally these things start out only known to insiders. It wouldn't surprise me if just about any and every individual closed reactionary community and cell of wannabe fascists had its own unique language of words and symbols. The main reason I wanted to write this video was to really articulate the fact that the worst of this stuff is being spread by completely low-profile people. You need to be on the lookout for it and preemptively call it out and combat it wherever you see it. I hadn't realized that many of my fellow lefties just fundamentally don't know what they're supposed to be on the lookout for. And I don't know where you'd even begin if you wanted to teach someone all of this stuff who hasn't had the organic experience of learning it through years of lurking image boards. For example, if you're just some normal lefty type, I can sit you down for a lesson on why online right-wingers appropriated a cartoon frog, and sure, you might get it. But can I reasonably expect anyone to follow along as I then begin to elaborate on what the difference between a Pepe, an Apu, a Groper, and a Honkler is without them thinking I'm completely insane? No. Half the right's own strategy is to make these memes of theirs so bizarre that anyone who calls them out looks ridiculous. And since it would be so hard for a regular person to connect all the dots here on their own, reactionaries have a lot of plausible deniability when they inevitably say that the loony left is just calling everything racist or whatever. With all this in mind, the best piece of advice I can offer anyone listening to this is simply to remain vigilant. Keep your wits about you and always be persistent in denouncing reactionary dog whistles anywhere and anytime you do see them. I simply can't comprehensively tell you what they all are. I wish I could, but the second you compile that list, it would be out of date. The whole thing moves so fast you can't pin it down. The very nature of these things makes them ever-changing and also near impossible to predict. If you do want to start recognizing these sorts of things so you can appropriately call them out, the best advice might simply be to stick your heads into places online where these people congregate. Brace yourselves for most likely seeing some pretty unpleasant discussions. But take a look at all the comments on right-wing Facebook pages and Twitter profiles and start looking for frequently repeating words or emojis. If you really want, try just hanging around somewhere like 4chan's notorious politically incorrect board for 15 minutes until you see a word you don't know. Google it, and the first result will probably be a resource like the Southern Poverty Law Center or the Anti-Defamation League, explaining that it too is, of course, a dog whistle. That's all I have to say for now. Just think about how you could learn to better recognize covert reactionaries, and remember to keep your eyes open. Once again, my name's Card. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye for now, and subscribe if you'd like to hear more from me in the future.